Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Chill Out Lounge here with the UBE Academy. I have a wonderful guest with me today. Hi, Florian. How are you?
Very well. Thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, we have a couple of not so nice topics or fascinating topics to cover today. Just for you listening or watching us, Florian is an associate director with Control Risk. He's based in Frankfurt. He has a PhD. Maybe why do you have a PhD? What subject is it?
Oh, in war studies.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, conflict prevention. So nothing too much to worry about.
Okay, conflict prevention. Well, this is maybe a good starting point for today. I just looked into my calendar, and it seems like the 1st of January is approaching fast, and this means Brexit is, well, finally coming, and it's coming with a vengeance, and it's only 5 weeks to go. And we have asked Florian to discuss with us what is Brexit going to do to us European business people. What is it? What impact will there be on the people, etc.? So today it's about Brexit. Yes, and I have to and I have to be truth to be told. Typically, I try to be as independent and as neutral as possible, even when we had us of in this. On this particular topic, I'm really deeply emotionally concerned because I still consider the UK as my second home. I spent a great time there. This was where my kids were raised, and now seeing them go, this is really a bummer. This is really painful. So I won't shed any tears, but we need to dig deep, and we want to discuss Brexit today. So, Florian, I've prepared a couple of questions and just things, a couple of talking. Pragmatic, practical side of things. What will we see happening in the next 5 weeks? What's the what's the roadmap? Is there any?
Yeah, it's a really good question because under normal circumstances, I think we would have all thought that by now we would be knowing what's coming. Well, we don't. So as you mentioned earlier, we have 35 days to go. So exactly 5 weeks. And I think the key thing is what happens in 5 weeks. In 5 weeks, the transition period that basically frees the status quo when the UK on the 1st of January 2020 comes to an end. What has happened since then was talks between the EU and the UK government about the future relationship, specifically a free trade agreement that is supposed to, basically now come into place as the UK exits both the single market and the EU customs union. Talks are continuing, but the challenge is that we still have a few key issues where there isn't any agreement. And these key issues are what the EU calls the so-called level playing field. Then it's around the governance of that treaty, specifically the dispute resolution mechanism. And it's about fishing rights, which is a particularly sensitive issue for countries such as France. Now, it's still not certain whether Michel Barnier will actually go to London over the weekend. Initially, he said it wouldn't make sense to go because the UK hasn't moved on any of these open issues. But now there are signs that he might still go. The key thing is we have 5 weeks left for a deal to be reached and for, well, in theory, the EU Parliament and 27 member state parliaments to ratify that deal so that it can come into effect immediately. In terms of the things to watch out for, there is a European Council summit on the 10th and 11th of December, which is viewed as a potential decision point where the EU heads of governments might actually broker the final version of a deal. And then the EU Parliament is supposed to vote on that deal on the 14th of December. Now, you will know from things like the European debt crisis that the EU is quite good at improvising. And in this case, the session for the EU Parliament, a virtual one, on the 28th of December, just in case. And there is also talk that in the event that a deal should be reached at the very last minute, it could basically enter into effect provisionally, assuming the EU Parliament has ratified it, and that then the member state parliaments would ratify it afterwards. But that hasn't been agreed yet. So, to summarize this point, still a lot of work to be done. 3 really important issues, not yet. Other issues that are linked to these issues are basically also up in the air. So we are sort of approaching the cliff edge at quite fast speed. And there's still an awful lot of uncertainty for businesses, which try to prepare for what's ahead.
Okay, but let's start with one thing. What took them so long? I mean, if we're business people. If we were running a company like this, we would be probably in severe difficulties because we probably wouldn't have the time. From our European perspective, and Florian, maybe you can shed some light on the UK perspective. It looks like that the UK government was just not willing or able to follow the process. Is this the case, or what's?
So I think one fundamental challenge throughout has been a lack of trust, and I think from the perspective of the UK, an overly legalistic approach from the EU to these negotiations, whereas the EU says we've been always transparent. We do things by the book. This is about preserving the integrity of the single market. And there are simply certain things that are not open for discussion because it's the law. And from the UK's perspective, that viewed as not pragmatic enough. And I think we should also keep in mind that, with the landslide election victory of the current Conservative government, they felt they had a mandate to push very hard for, basically a deal or an outcome that would serve their constituents. And, they campaigned on Get Brexit Done. And I think, when you look at the main protagonists there, a lot actually are probably convinced that the UK can also thrive outside the EU, even if it comes to a no-deal Brexit. So I think the room for compromise, primarily for political reasons, has been quite limited for a long time. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic led to delays in the talk, which were always ambitious as far as the timeline is concerned. And it is basically an aggregation of factors, but also, 2 conflicting negotiating approaches that under extreme time pressure makes it difficult to resolve actually very, very complex and complicated issues.
Right, and there's a lot of, you said it already, there's a lot of emotion somewhere involved. Why are these bloody fishing rights so important? I don't get it. I mean, I'm an economist. If I look at the contribution of fishing to the EU gross domestic product and to the UK gross domestic product, it is netta. So why fishing rights?
I think it points to some of the, cross-cutting issues that we have in Western Europe, and one is, the divide between the countryside, and I would include coastal communities to the countryside, and urban centers. It's a particular issue in France, and you will remember that up until the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had 18 months of uninterrupted protests that actually started in the countryside, that are driven by a sense that metropolitan elites don't get the what matters in the real lives of people who live elsewhere. And for coastal communities in northern France in particular, which have struggled for quite some time, and where the fishing industry has also struggled for quite some time, losing access to these waters would basically sound the death knell to what's left of this industry, which may not be important in economic terms, but it's important in terms of identity. And when we look at the political polarization that has become a key feature of the political landscape in Europe, the issue of identities is very important there. And this is basically what President Macron, but also other EU leaders can't afford, is that more arguments, or that a strong argument can be made that they are selling out coastal communities just for big business to thrive.
Okay, so it's about identity. So the Brexit discussion is similar to what we see in Poland, what we have seen in the US. It is a dispute between the city and the countryside. That's interesting. We are where we are, but what is happen then after 1st of January? Now, you have explained to us the underlying emotional reason. We understand what's going to happen the next 5 weeks. It will be something in which the Britain is actually fantastic at muddling through with a pragmatic approach. This is what I learned when I lived there, compared to the rather legalistic institution approach of the European Union. But they will some form of arrangement will be in place on the 1st of January. But what then? So what kind of scenarios can we expect?
Well, one thing that I should add is that despite legalistic approach, the EU is also quite good when it comes to muddling through and also clinching last-minute compromises. But it depends on goodwill and on trust. And we touched on it. That's what is.
Yes. If I just why is there a lack of trust? You said that twice. That's interesting, because I would hope we have been in the European Union together for 40 years or so. Lack of trust on which sides, and let's talk about this. I think that's interesting.
Well, it is about some of the key protagonists. And when you reflect on how the current British Prime Minister Boris Johnson built his career as a journalist in Brussels, and also how he reported about the EU, that hasn't been forgotten, right? So he was a key voice back in the day who basically made some of this anti-EU Eurosceptic narratives who made them big. That hasn't been forgotten. That is one thing. And I think, why has that become so important? Because in contrast to the previous Conservative government, this government has actually questioned whether some of the agreements that had been reached, and that treaty, the withdrawal agreement, whether these could still stand. And you may have heard the talk about the UK Internal Market Bill, where the government has actually questioned, or rather legislated, that certain parts of the withdrawal agreement could be breached. And this has resulted in this massive lack of trust, because there is just, at this stage, considering also Johnson's history and the history of some of the members of the cabinet, there isn't the trust that something like this couldn't happen again. And this is also why the EU is so insistent that you basically have very clear rules, that there's a solid dispute resolution mechanism to make sure that whatever deal is agreed, that this is actually also something solid that the people and business can rely on.
And that's enforceable to some degree. Okay,
Exactly.
So what are the scenarios then? Sorry, but I need to get this trust thing out of my system. Now I understand this, but now give me your scenarios. We're scared. It is unclear. We're in a turmoil world. Help me.
So we're facing sort of a binary outcome, right? Deal or no deal. So Our, that is control risks, most likely scenario is still that a deal will be reached. That means that a free trade agreement between the UK and EU will be concluded. And I assume we'll discuss some of the elements of that agreement in a moment. Why do we think that, despite the lack of time, a deal is still, the most likely scenario? Because it is in the best interest of both sides. Now, you may argue, well, if rationality
Exactly.
had triumphed in all these situations, we wouldn't be in all the different messes that the world has experienced over the past, 5 to 10 years. But still, I think the COVID-19 pandemic and the enormous economic impacts, but or socioeconomic impacts, it has concentrated minds. Now, what has also happened is that a hardcore Brexiteer, Dominic Cummings, who was the de facto chief of staff in 10 Downing Street, departed a few weeks ago. And that it has at least been reported that the two most important cabinet members, that is Michael Gove, the cabinet secretary, and Rishi Sunak, the finance minister, are at least privately in favor of a deal to minimize any additional economic disruptions in the current circumstances. So that sort of gives some hope. And what we also have is an apparent readiness on the EU's part to negotiate until the very last minute. I think the EU has understood some of the domestic pressures Johnson is under, due to some of the challenges the UK government and in part of its own making has experienced in relation to handling the COVID-19 pandemic. Backbenchers, so the his MPs who are not part of the cabinet or the extended cabinet are concerned about his leadership, and he is particularly with those who favor a hard Brexit and an uncompromising stance. He is also not sure whether their support will hold up if he compromises too much and too quickly. So the EU Commission has, for example, been quite careful in not emphasizing no deal preparations in recent weeks, despite member state governments actually asking them to do that. But they want to keep that window of that negotiating window open to reach a deal. So I think it's not hopeless, and this is why all in all, this is our most likely scenario. Now,
that's interesting, because what the last point you just, another spectator recently wrote, the less we hear, the more likely will be an agreement, because nobody has to nobody has to scream from the wings and position him or herself for a failure. So therefore, this is, you're supporting this view that most likely we will see an agreement. Now, in the long run, that's good news. In some shape or form, pan out. But short and medium run implications for European businesses. What does this mean for me having a company that trades with UK counterparts, or even has operations there?
So I think, and this is where it gets tricky, right? So
I was afraid. So yes.
Yes. So in the short term, the difference between no deal, that would mean basically the reintroduction of tariffs on trade, different from the trade deal that is currently being negotiated, because the UK government, with the mandate it received in the last general election, has basically agreed to only seek a very limited trade deal, right, and not sort of a far-reaching free trade agreement, as some would have hoped. So, as I mentioned earlier, the UK will leave the EU single market, and it will also leave the EU Union. So, even in the event of that trade deal being concluded, there will be more red tape, and there will be higher costs for businesses, because you will get more administrative procedures happening at the border. right? It won't be frictionless trade. What you would get, and at least this is what the UK wants, is basically no tariffs on most goods. That would be, the positive outcome, right? That with that deal in place, you'd have to do you'd have to file some paperwork. You may need certain certifications to continue trading, but the relationship won't become less competitive because you suddenly have tariffs in play.
Mhm.
When it comes to regulatory, right? At the moment, wherever EU rules apply, it's basically the same. There isn't an immediate impact because what the UK did to minimize disruption is that it basically put all relevant, EU regulations in that sense that were directly applicable. They transposed them into UK law and put them on the statute books, so they would still be in place. So there isn't an immediate change. However, and this is where the whole thing becomes more complicated if we should head into the no deal scenario. The trade deal would preserve certain standards, so that the regulatory frameworks, at least in some areas, remain remain somewhat in sync. Under a no deal scenario, the UK could basically do whatever it wants. And this is also, one of the reasons why some in the cabinet and the arch Brexiteers, so to speak, why they prefer no deal, because there wouldn't be any limitations on regulatory change this or future UK government could introduce. And maybe to just highlight, one final thing that will change, that is all around, and we'll touch on it in a moment, I guess, the freedom of movement of people between the UK and the EU. There will be changes no matter whether we get no deal or we get we get this trade deal, because it will ultimately fall to member states and the UK governments to find new rules there.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. Of course, you have a lot of friends from all places around the world, being based in the UK, and a lot of people from Britain living in Germany. This is our network. These are our people. Now, most of my friends over there, they are independent of their passport, whether it's a UK passport or a European passport. They're deeply concerned, and surprised how many of my English friends suddenly discovered they had an Irish grandmother, or and so there was a lot of passport hunting going on over the last couple of years. However, now things will materialize, and what will happen to the people on both sides of the channel? Will we see mass deportations in the UK, from the UK to Europe, or will we see an influx of British people applying for German passports? What's going to happen?
So,
That's
to
scary.
provide some reassurance there, right? I think in that area, common sense has, as far as protecting the rights of are concerned. So in the UK, for example, EU residents who who already live there or who move there until the 31st of December will be able to apply for settled status. That is a path towards permanent residency. On the other side, we have similar rules. Just 3 days ago, a law in Germany entered into force that guarantees the resident citizens living in Germany. Other European countries have introduced similar rules. In the German case, what will happen is that UK nationals will have to register with the Foreigners Authority. It's just a formality, and that will basically then lead to permanent residence. So, this is the positive part, right? Of course, one of the challenges is that UK nationals who live in Germany right now, under the old rules, would have been able to just move across to France, right? Without any formalities, without any challenges. That won't be possible anymore. They can move back to the UK, but just because they have a title of residence in Germany doesn't give them the right to live and work in another EU member state, right? So that is a change. But particularly, for anyone now moving, they will face the higher administrative hurdles. They may face quite significant costs for visa applications. And they also face a lot of uncertainty, because some of these rules, particularly around what they have to do in terms of getting visas and all that, they are still up in the air. They still need to be sorted out, and it will all be done on the basis of. So in a way, also, how these next weeks pan out will be really important in terms of whether they actually, leave over some goodwill and a desire to strengthen relations, or whether basically, both sides will basically need a break from each other, so to speak. And I think, in other good news, things like tax residency, that won't be affected, because it has been a matter, between member states and the UK all along. So there aren't any changes. But in terms of your right to choose the place where you live and work, there will be changes, both for UK residents wishing to move to the EU and vice versa.
Okay. So how will this pan out in the long run? I mean, we've talked about the scenarios. You still believe there is a agreement, most likely, that it will be disruptive for European businesses, at least in the short run, for those people who live in the UK, or UK people living in Europe. There will be slight changes, but nothing dramatic. So, but what is the long road ahead, and how bumpy will this road want to be?
Well, one thing that's important to say, when I say it's the most likely scenario that we'll get a deal, doesn't mean that, a no deal isn't a credible alternative, right? It's highly credible. Lots of things could still go wrong, and we may end up without a deal, because time's in short supply, and, relations. The UK government may feel that it cannot compromise on these issues for domestic reasons, or, because the EU is too compromising, the deal may not get ratified on the other side, right? So I think key takeaway for business before we sort of look ahead is you need to be prepared for no deal to happen. Because if we'd be talking in probabilities, a deal, is more likely, but we're not talking about something like a 90% chance for a deal or something like that, right? So think about your exposure, what your relationship in terms of business with the UK looks like, and prepare yourself that you may, look at a very sort of different landscape in 5 weeks' time. The other thing is, and this is where we're coming to the long term, no matter what will happen, it's not the end of the story. And this is actually where, where geography comes into play. The UK is where it is. It's, just next to the European continent. And the trading relationship between the two is worth, in total, almost $1 trillion at this stage. So no matter what happens, they will still have to discuss how this relationship is supposed to evolve in the future. It probably won't be done in the public, or not as much in the public, but it will still happen. And this is where, it gets more interesting as far as the different outcomes are concerned. Even if this limited trade deal doesn't matter that much in terms of, the practical issues it solves, it would at least be a basis to build on. And it would ensure, it will provide a framework for relations to evolve, right? Whereas if this ends without a deal, if we're heading towards an entirely acrimonious divorce, the damage to relations will be lasting. And what should you expect? The EU will look very, very closely at what this UK government, but also future UK governments do in terms of regulatory change, how much they will deregulate. People in Brussels haven't forgotten this idea of Singapore on Thames, basically turning the UK into a massive offshore center, which would, push a course of heavy deregulation, low tax, and basically undercut the single market by pushing an entirely different economic model. Now, those who've been in favor of that at the moment, they don't have as much a say in UK politics, right? So it's not an immediate concern, but the EU always thinks long term, and they will look at this very closely. If they should fear that the UK is heading into that direction, they will think about countermeasures, right? Such as higher tariffs, but I think also the political relationship. And we know that, cooperation in the areas of security, for example, are really critical for both. They won't develop as well as they would in a scenario where we ensure a basic level of cooperation. And, the other thing is, if we end up with no deal, it will, compound some of the internal challenges in the UK, particularly around, the UK's future itself. Because you may remember that the Scottish people in particular voted overwhelmingly in favor of staying in the EU. And the Scottish devolved administration has complained bitterly about, the views of Scots, not these negotiations. And, a complete breakdown in the trading relationship. And, let's not overstate it, trade would still continue, but we'd be talking about WTO terms, tariffs, and it would just be more challenging. They would see this as, they would feel that it would strengthen the cause for Scottish independence. And that basically raises questions about, the stability of UK politics in the medium to long term.
Exactly. Then, so basically, if there is no deal, we need to watch out for a little Britain, meaning that both Ireland plus plus Scotland, or Northern Ireland plus Scotland may start thinking about separating. Is this what you're saying?
Well, so two issues. Let's talk about Ireland first. Ireland is, interestingly enough, the less problematic one, because you have a government in Dublin that has no interest whatsoever in upsetting the status quo, right? What would change that would be an election victory of Sinn Féin. But that is highly unlikely, and the other two main parties, are not even thinking about upsetting the peace settlement that is in place. So it is, I think the bigger challenge would be that if you get this customs border down the Irish Sea, that that unionists in Northern Ireland may actually up the pressure and may try, to change the new status quo. But there is, I think, sufficient interest both in London and Dublin to maintain the situation in Ireland, because the memories of the fighting and the insecurity is still pretty fresh. So Ireland is, if it is, really a long-term issue. Okay. Scotland is different, and I think in Scotland, again, it's not that deal or no deal immediately makes a difference, because both are unacceptable from the Scottish perspective. But I think in terms of building a narrative, no deal would make it easier for the Scottish National Party to push this line that that Westminster isn't pursuing the interests of Scots. But we have elections coming up in Scotland next year, and the SNP will campaign very hard, no matter what, on the promise of seeking another referendum.
Okay.
On the basis of of Brexit, because when they had the referendum in 2014, there was something like an agreement that, this would be a referendum that should settle the issue for a generation unless a massive change in circumstances. And the S&P says we have this massive change in circumstances due to Brexit.
And this will be aggravated in case of a no deal.
Yes.
I understand this. Okay, Florian, thank you so much. This was rolling or comforting me, probably not, but I think I see much clearer now, and hopefully so do our listeners. Now, as always, the last 60 seconds of this show all yours. So now we give you 60 seconds where you can say whatever you wanted to. Please.
Oliver, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this show today. To our listeners, if you enjoyed the past 30 minutes, I would like to invite you to join a ContraRisk webinar, a webinar series actually. It's called Geopolitics Meets. In our next session on the 15th of December, we'll talk about geopolitics and public health and what businesses should think about now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our guest will be Dr. Petra Dickmann, an expert in public health, infectious diseases, and risk communication. And for more information and how to register for this webinar, visit controlrisks.com/DE. And for more of ContraRisk insights and a detailed, or more detailed information on our services, go to contrarisk.com. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.
Florian, thank you so much. Yes, this was the Friday afternoon chill out with the UBE Academy. Thank you so much, Dr. Florian Otto, Associate Director with ContraRisk, for helping us understanding the upcoming Brexit scenarios. Thank you so much. Take care. Please always wear masks. Stay healthy, stay safe, and see you again next week. Bye-bye.